Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. This time around, we are looking into a topic that combines the worst of geopolitical strategy and corporate greed. We're talking about Germany's decades-long love affair with Russian gas, an energy dependence so misguided it makes eating sushi from a gas station seem like a calculated risk. Now, Europe's imports of Russian gas are down to a trickle. Good news, right? Well, not entirely, because even as Europe celebrates its hard-fought energy independence, Germany seems to be eyeing the old Gazprom pipeline with the same longing that X is reserved for late-night texts. And that's where the story begins. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Nuclear threats have been the bread and butter of Russian rhetoric since Moscow began its invasion of Ukraine. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says that these threats are just that, threats, and declared that, to quote, "We will not let ourselves be intimidated." This latest nuclear development from Russia's side comes after the US allowed Kiev to launch the missiles it provided deep into Russian territory, a decision which has, to say the least, made Vladimir Putin's life much more difficult.
Aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be regarded as a joint attack on Russia.
The situation has led to some concern. Sweden has distributed a special booklet to citizens about what to do in a worst-case war scenario. There have also been reports that Russia itself has been developing mobile shelters to protect against nuclear fallout. But while the Russian side is all too eager to rattle on about how big and scary its nuclear stockpile is, America has been speaking softly on the matter.
We have not seen any reason to adjust our own nuclear posture, but we will continue to call on Russia to stop bellicose and irresponsible rhetoric.
To recall the words of one US President Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. In late 2021 and early 2022, Russia weaponized its natural gas supplies, throttling deliveries to Europe to punish countries for supporting Ukraine. Germany, being Russia's best energy customer for years, found itself in the awkward position of funding a war it opposed. Imagine ordering takeout, only to realize the delivery guy is using the tip to buy a crowbar to rob your house. Not a good look at all. So Germany's energy policy has been guided by two principles over the last few decades. Neue Ostpolitik, a policy of cozying up to Russia to keep the peace, and Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade. Which, in hindsight, might as well have been called "What if we bribe the bear not to maul us?" It's an approach rooted in optimism or possibly deliberate denial. The key idea was simple. If Germany bought enough gas from Russia, Vladimir Putin would see the economic benefits of stability and stop acting like, well, Vladimir Putin. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Instead, successive German governments let the military atrophy, vetoed NATO's plans for Eastern Europe, and basically became Putin's favorite business partner. All the while, Russian cyber attacks and assassinations were happening right on their doorstep. So let's talk about the people who made this mess possible. First, Gerhard Schröder. As Chancellor, Schröder greenlit the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, then left office and immediately joined Gazprom, becoming Employee of the Month at Moscow's propaganda department. Next came Angela Merkel, who doubled down with Nord Stream 2 despite Russia invading Ukraine in 2014 and committing assassinations across Europe. Merkel famously said she had no illusions that Putin would change, which raises the question, why keep doubling down? That's not strategy, that's Stockholm Syndrome. And finally, we have Olaf Scholz. Scholz initially refused to send weapons to Ukraine and famously, or infamously, offered Kiev 5,000 helmets instead. Now, Scholz did make a bold pivot after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, promising a Zeitenwende, a new era for German defense and energy policy. Germany quickly replaced Russian gas, ramped up military aid to Ukraine, and pledged to spend 2% of GDP on defense. And much like watching a couch potato suddenly decide to run a marathon, well, it's impressive, but you're also wondering how long it will last. Well, we actually have our answer. Last month, Germany slashed its military aid for Ukraine in the 2025 budget by half. Scholz, eyeing next year's elections, seems ready to pivot again, this time positioning himself as the peace chancellor. And you know what that means, right? Germany might be getting ready to thaw relations with Russia. Let's be clear, allowing Nord Stream 2 sanctions to expire would send a terrible message, not just to Russia, but to Germany's energy sector, which is itching to restore ties with Moscow. These are the same people who sold Germany's largest gas storage facility to Gazprom. You know, because that turned out well last time. So, what can we do? First, the US should push for laws that prevent former officials from cashing in with Russian state enterprises. No more Schröders, thank you very much. Vielen Dank. Germany's energy dependence on Russia didn't just hurt Germany, it destabilized the entire continent. We can't let that happen again, now can we? And now here to shed more light on the issue is Łukasz Jasiński, analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So Chancellor Olaf Scholz calls Vladimir Putin after more than 2 years. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, lots of things can go wrong in this situation.
And apparently they did.
That's right. Well, first and foremost, it's undermined the confidence of other countries, such as Poland, not to mention Ukraine, of course, in Chancellor Scholz's intention. Because it's quite clear that you cannot stop Putin with making telephone calls, that these telephone calls cannot bring any breakthrough, because Putin is simply not interested in making any kind of breakthrough at this point of the war, of the conflict. From my point of view, there are two main drives, two main factors that were standing behind this initiative. First and foremost, these are the parliamentary elections. In Germany, we will have a snap elections for the Bundestag, which will be held on 23rd of February, so very soon. And Chancellor Scholz has been under growing pressure of populist parties, Sarah Wagenknecht's alliance and the AfD, so Alternative for Germany. These two parties has been pushing for so-called more negotiations, more diplomacy towards Russia, and to put it frankly, they have been pushing towards a reset in relations between Germany and Russia.
So Olaf Scholz wants to essentially outdo them in this sort of narrative and say, peaceful negotiations is my middle name. And he ends up calling Vladimir Putin. And the second reason?
Well, to some extent, Chancellor Scholz also has this impression that when Donald Trump, so the president-elect in the US, suggests that he will attempt to make some kind of deal with Russia, that he will call Vladimir Putin, or perhaps already called Vladimir Putin several times, then that also Germany should be somewhere sitting there at the table and not only remain as an observer of this situation. But from my point of view, I would suggest that the most important driver was simply this internal political situation, the fact that Chancellor Scholz has an idea of presenting himself to the German society, to his own electorate, as so-called Chancellor of Peace. So, on the other hand, he stresses that we are helping Ukraine, we will be helping Ukraine further on. We initiated this Zeitenwende, so lots of changes like beefing up military spending from the Bundeswehr. But on the other side, we will still remain to look for some kind of platforms for dialogue, cooperation, maybe not cooperation, but dialogue with Russia, and also in order to keep Germany safe. Keep Germany safe from war, keep NATO safe from spreading this conflict to the NATO
potential
territory and so on.
I mean, this is a narrative, isn't it? And before we consider the implications of this conversation between Mr. Scholz and Mr. Putin, let's briefly consider the question of the energy sector. Just to emphasize that this is also a consideration. Many critics say Germany would absolutely love to resume some sort of a trade exchange with Russia, in particular, including cheap, affordable energy. Do you think that this could be a factor?
Well, undoubtedly there are some pro-Russian lobbyists still active somewhere there in the background who would love to have some kind of reset when it comes to obtaining cheap energy, especially cheap gas from Russia, because this cheap gas, gas of affordable price was one of the pillars of this whole economic model in Germany that actually ended in 2022, and now Germany have been still struggling to find another way out of the economical stagnation here. So this perhaps can also be a factor, one of the drives that influences Scholz to still try to maintain these channels of communication with Kremlin.
So overall, obviously, it's a factor to consider, especially in the light of the recent news. We'll just, basically outline this. The issue that LNG terminals were told not to accept Russian LNG, and the questions arose, okay, so if they are told not to do so now, did they do so before? They were not supposed to, in theory. A very interesting debate, but this is beside the point right now. Let's focus on the conversation between the two leaders. So apparently Olaf Scholz wanted to enlighten Vladimir Putin, from the reports that we get, as to the true nature of the war. So he's advising him now. He's telling him that, your generals are not telling you the whole truth. This does sound a bit preposterous, to say the least. Don't you think that by doing so, the Chancellor simply opened himself up to more criticism?
Well, Chancellor Scholz encountered lots of criticism because of this phone call. It's treated as signaling its own weakness towards Putin, first and foremost, because from the point of view of Russia, this is a signal that, okay, we are not totally isolated by the West. This was the first telephone conversation between Scholz and Putin since 2022, I think. So it was 2 years without such a conversation. Chancellor Scholz tries to present himself as a person who tries to influence on Putin somehow with reasonable arguments, but
that didn't work. I mean, you had leaders doing the same thing before the war started, including Olaf Scholz himself, but also Emmanuel Macron. And these attempts today, they tend to be ridiculed because they were not efficient. And do you think that there is still an opportunity to somehow influence, like you're saying, in a rational manner? Because just recently, there was this report about a leaked Russian plan for Ukraine. We don't really know where this plan originates from. And, Kyiv Independent, which reported on that, they said they couldn't independently verify its existence, but it's essentially about partitioning Ukraine. Russia wants to take the territories it partially controls. The center part of Ukraine would be a puppet state with regime change. And the rest, they will try to peddle to other countries, hoping that they might participate in partitioning. Of course they won't, like countries like Poland, Romania, not really interested, because we have a different viewpoint on sovereignty. But this kind of indicates that Russia did not abandon these plans. They are not minimalist plans. They simply want Ukraine to cease to exist. So what's the point in trying to negotiate rationally if Putin, he does not have this in his mind to stop this conflict before achieving these maximalist objectives?
Well, this is one of the problems with Germany's posture towards the war, especially when it comes to drawing the so-called red lines. I suppose that perhaps the biggest mistake of Chancellor Scholz and his advisors is officially informing Putin what we will not do. The very good example of it is the case of Taurus missiles. There have been numerous attempts made by other parties in order to, maybe not force, but to suggest Chancellor Scholz to finally agree to sending these missiles to Ukraine. But
including in his own government.
That's right, including his own government, including the Greens party and the FDP, so the former coalition party.
As I mean, the government is fractured now, so.
That's right. However, this ended with a failure because of Chancellor Scholz's position. The problem with Chancellor Scholz is that he remains extremely cautious, which of course resembles the fears of part of his electorate, because the collective remembrance of the Cold War, of living under constant threat of nuclear war between the Soviet Union and NATO, still remains an important part of collective remembrance in Germany, especially in western lands of Germany, and especially among SPD, so the Social Democratic electorate.
But to be fair, is it unique to Olaf Scholz? I mean, you could say the same thing about the Biden administration. They are helping Ukraine, but not helping enough, some people say, and they are acting under intense fear of escalation. So it sounds familiar.
Yes, and there is small wonder then. Until today, it was so that Chancellor Scholz was quite obviously waiting for every move from Washington, and then when US agreed, for example, on sending Abrams tanks to Ukraine, then he eventually agreed on sending Leopards. So this is this constant pattern of waiting for the American administration and still
being a follower, not a leader. But to be fair, he did send more of these tanks than the US did.
Well, eventually, yes, but it lasted. These internal discussions within Germany, these internal discussions in Bundestag, what kind of weapons can we send, what kind of weapon is so-called lethal weapon and what not, that lasted actually many months. And I dare say it also undermined Germany's position as a reliable ally in NATO.
And of course, you know, the conclusion here is that when it comes to possible peaceful resolution, peaceful intentions on the part of Russia, we have reports that the Russians fired an ICBM, non-nuclear, but still, an intercontinental ballistic missile into Ukraine with a conventional warhead, but still peaceful intentions, well, not necessarily, one could say, perhaps slightly ironically, but still. Łukasz Jasiński was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia seems to be back to one of its favorite pastimes, deciding the borders of European states for them. A recent alleged plan of Moscow apparently sees Ukraine cut into 3 parts, all to Russia's benefit, of course.
Russia won't stop weaving dreams about its victory in Ukraine. Despite its forces currently being in the thick of it, Russian leadership seems to have a plan not just for the war's end, but for the next 20 years. Interfax Ukraine says, citing sources within Ukrainian intelligence, that Moscow may try to convey its plan for a new world order till 2045 to the United States. This includes a partition of Ukraine. According to this design, Putin would receive the eastern regions, while the western parts would go to countries like Poland or Romania. The middle would be a Russian-controlled puppet state. It is difficult to say how likely it would be that Putin would present such a scheme at peace negotiations. He says that he is ready to meet with Donald Trump to talk peace. Reuters, based on its Kremlin sources, reports that apparently Putin is ready to withdraw from parts of the occupied Kharkiv and Mykolaiv regions. Crimea and those regions where Russia holds 70 to 80% of territory are to be out of the question, however.
And staying on the subject of odd Russian schemes, probes into the recent damage to fiber optic communications cables on the Baltic seabed slowly seem to be pointing to Russian meddling. However, Moscow is not the only suspect.
A lot is amiss in the Baltic Sea. The damage to the fiber optic cables, which link Finland to Germany and Sweden to Lithuania, has left European leadership scratching their heads. Both the US and European countries have pointed to Russian hybrid warfare activities from the past, which have only intensified as the war in Ukraine has progressed. Though Moscow has always denied that it sabotages Western infrastructure in retaliation for aiding Ukraine. But Europe, Russia, and the United States aren't the only ones with presence in the sea. The Danish Navy has informed that it is currently monitoring a Chinese cargo ship as part of a wide investigation into the damaged cables. The ship, the Yipeng 3, was on its way from Russia to Egypt and had been sailing close to where the cables linking Lithuania and Sweden are located. There is, however, no concrete evidence that the Chinese ship was involved.
And speaking of European security, Estonia has advocated that European nations need to prepare to deploy military forces to Ukraine. This comes as the possibility of a peace deal negotiated by Donald Trump becomes increasingly likely.
NATO is the most powerful military alliance in history. It is built mainly on the backbone of the US's military power, with Europe usually playing second fiddle. Estonia's foreign minister believes that the time has come for Europe to play a more active role in deterring Russian aggression. While he agrees that security guarantees for Ukraine will be needed, The best would be a NATO membership, which would require Washington's approval. And there have been concerns whether Donald Trump's administration will pressure Kiev to surrender on less than favourable terms. As one of NATO's frontline nations, Estonia is acutely aware of the danger Russia poses. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that it wants to see Russia's ambitions slapped aside. While it sees the US as an important ally, the Baltic state has often emphasized that it is Europe, in the end, that will face the brunt of any possible Russian aggression, and that it is Europe which should start caring more about how to prevent, or should the worst come to pass, oppose it.
4 years after mass protests challenged Alexander Lukashenko's authoritarian rule in Belarus, trials against demonstrators continue, with several families now facing charges.
Multiple proceedings targeting families accused of taking part in the 2020 demonstrations are currently underway in Minsk courts. On paper, they are accused of active participation in actions grossly violating public order. In reality, they dared to question the legality of the Belarusian presidential elections, an offense Alexander Lukashenko doesn't forgive. There are thousands of cases like this in the country. In 2020, protests erupted after a disputed presidential election, which was widely condemned as fraudulent by the United States, the European Union, and other international bodies. The protests demanding Lukashenko's resignation were met with violent crackdowns, mass arrests, and allegations of torture. Many opposition figures remain imprisoned or in exile, while Lukashenko refuses to engage with critics or international calls for reform.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.